Imagine a haunting so powerful that even after 200 years, its story has never lost momentum. One that not only completely affected a family, but also its slaves, visitors, neighbors, and even a president. This is the reason that to this day, people are still fascinated by the Bell Witch and the haunting and death surrounding the legend. There's many books, websites, and movies out there dedicated to the subject. This video is not the exception. And if you're here, then you just might be one of the many captivated by it as well. Lucky for you, I'm about to give you a pretty decent account of what happened all those years ago. Let's get started then. Are you ready? Then take my hand, hold it tight, and let's walk into the darkness together. Way back in 1817, John Bell Sr. and his family had been living in Robertson County, Tennessee, close to the Red River. For the most part, they were a normal family. John had married his wife Lucy in 1782 at around the age of 32, and they began living their life together, having 9 children altogether, which was a normal number for that time. In 1804, the family moved to a 328-acre farm in northern Robertson County, which is now simply known as Adams, Tennessee. John even became an elder at the Red River Baptist Church, and the Bells seemed to be well respected in the area. The only record of the family having problems before the haunting was with their neighbor, a woman by the name of Mary Catherine Batts, who was usually just called Kate Batts by everyone. Kate had a very iffy reputation, though. She was notorious for misusing words and was a generally strange person. This, of course, must have meant that she practiced the occult, as it was usually believed at the time about anyone that was slightly different. Now, despite rumors that she practiced black magic, John Bell thought it was a good idea to have an argument with her brother-in-law, Benjamin Batts, over the sale of a slave. The details of the argument were muddy, and pretty soon the rumor had become that it was Kate and John who had the argument, and later on everyone believed that it had been Kate who had created the Bell Witch to seek revenge on the family. It is important to state that Kate died many years after John, which means that despite popular belief, her spirit was definitely not the one haunting the Bell family. There is no one ruling out her actually using black magic to conjure a spirit to haunt them, or that Kate used another way to produce the witch, though. That, however, is simply an observation by yours truly. Now, the very first incident surrounding the legend and what truly started the weirdness was when one day John Bell had innocently gone to inspect his crops and noticed a strange creature standing halfway down one of the rows of corn. The thing was unnatural. It had the body of a big black dog and the head of a rabbit. Shocked, and probably scared as all hell, John pulled out a pistol and shot at it several times until the creature darted away through the crops and into the woods. Usually a normal person would tell someone, or, everyone, what happened, but John decided not to tell a soul, probably to avoid sounding crazy. That didn't really work out so well for him, since during dinner, the whole family began to hear knocking on the walls, windows, and doors of the house. The family tried to find the culprit but failed, and had to eventually end their search empty-handed. This was the beginning, but not the end of this haunting. The apparitions and sounds continued throughout the years that the haunting occurred. What comes next are some of the many other incidents. Drury Bell, one of John Bell's sons, once saw an unknown bird of what he called extraordinary size perched on the fence. When he tried to approach it, the bird flew away. That may not seem like a big deal at first glance, but if you think about it, these people lived in this farm for years. It was their home, and as such, they knew the area they called home just as well as we know ours, and what type of animals reside in it. If the bird had been from the area, they would have recognized it, especially being an animal of extraordinary size. Or maybe a neighbor could have remarked on what a big bird they had just seen, but nothing of the sort ever happened. Dean, who was one of the slaves working for the Bell family, said that he was constantly followed by an unknown, huge black dog or wolf during the evenings when he had to walk to visit his wife. This dog, however, was said to sometimes appear with 2 heads and other times with none at all, but it never seemed to have appeared to Dean with the rabbit's head as it did to John. Another of John's children, Elizabeth, or Betsy as she was called, reported seeing strange creatures roaming the property, and even claimed she saw a girl's body in a green dress that was swinging from the limb of an oak tree near the woods. The house also became riddled with the noises from the knocking on the walls, windows, and doors, which continued to happen often, and now even wings flapping against the ceiling. The children would also complain that they heard rats gnawing their bedposts at night, but when the beds were checked, they were completely normal and untouched. The sound of heavy objects hitting the floor was quite common, and they'd also heard 2 chained dogs snarling and fighting, their chains dragging across the floor. Betsy even claimed to hear the sound of someone being strangled. The house was searched and proven to be rat-free, and the reason for the noises was never found. Throughout this whole time, the family had decided to keep these events quiet and not tell anyone. However, as the haunting progressed, they eventually gave in and reached out to a neighbor and friend by the name of James Johnston. After hearing an account of the things that were happening, James Johnston and his wife decided to spend the night at the Bell farm. After they had retired for the night, James was awakened by all of his covers being ripped off of the bed by some sort of invisible force, which then began to slap him. He then decided to speak to the force and said, "In the name of God, who are you?" There was no reply to this question, but the disturbances stopped for the remainder of the night. The next morning, James would tell John what happened and state that it was an evil spirit, just like in the Bible. John's children had already complained about similar incidents, so it didn't come as a surprise to him. This particular incident is said to have been a sort of trigger, because after what happened with James, all of the occurrences in the household tripled in strength. The unknown force finally began to speak. When asked one day who it was and what it wanted, it replied, "I am a spirit. I was once very happy, but I was disturbed and made unhappy. I am the spirit of the person who was buried in the woods nearby, and the grave was disturbed, my bones disinterred and scattered, and one of my teeth was lost under this house. I am here looking for that tooth." The voice also claimed to be old Kate Bat's witch, and liked when it was called that, but as I said before, it is impossible that it was Kate Bat who was haunting the bells. By this time, the children were being struck, pinched, scratched, and had their hair pulled. The spirit also began to show a severe dislike for Betsy and John Sr., who it attacked more often, even cursing John, or old Jack Bell as it liked to call him, and proclaiming it wanted him dead. At some point, Betsy became engaged to her childhood sweetheart, Joshua Gardner. For some unknown reason, the witch became angry when it happened and swore it would not leave the Bell family until they broke up and John Bell was dead. Betsy eventually put off the marriage to Joshua, but didn't break off the relationship. The attacks on Betsy became so frequent that it began to affect her in other ways. She looked exhausted all the time and even began to faint at times. There was no rest from the spirit because it would follow and torment her everywhere. Her parents began to send her to a neighbor's house to try and give her a break from the mental strain, but Betsy claimed that the witch even followed her there. "My first night away from home was spent with Denny Thorne," she said. When we retired, there came a loud knocking on our outside door, which seemed to fly open and a great gust of wind felt. Denny sprang up at once and lit a candle. To our surprise, the door was not open. Then a voice spoke softly. "Betsy, you should not have come here. You know I can follow you anywhere. Now get a good night's sleep." A soft hand patted my cheek, and the voice again assured us that we would not be disturbed that night. It continued more or less in that way. The spirit sent Drury and one of his brother-in-laws, Bennett Porter, who was married to John's daughter Esther, on a search for buried treasure which they never found. The spirit also seemed to pick up gossiping about the neighbors as one of its new favorite pastimes, often commenting on things that it had witnessed while visiting them. There was a particular moment when the witch began to repeat word for word 2 different sermons that were being given at the exact same time. One of them was by the Reverend James Gunn of the Bethel Methodist Church, and the other was given by Mr. Sugg Fort. They were giving these sermons miles away from each other. which shows that the spirit could be in multiple places at the same time. Dean, the Bell's slave that was being followed by the dog, also began to state that he had been turned into a mule multiple times and attacked by the witch. The other slaves also reported being mistreated by the entity. It tormented them by beating them, refusing them entrance into the house, and insulting them, even throwing racial slurs their way. Visitors of all kinds were also tormented by the witch. It once set the 3 Bell house dogs, Caesar, Tick, and Bulger, on a group of traveling Shakers. For those of you who don't know what they are, Shakers were a religious group who were around at the time. They didn't believe in procreation, and they adopted or converted others in order to get new members to join them. They were named Shakers because of the way they moved, or, well, rather shook, during worship. When word spread of the haunting, a popular conjurer by the name of Mr. Mize came from Kentucky to the Bell household to try to exorcise the spirit. It mocked him and ended up scaring him off with its antics. Another friend of the family named William Porter said that the witch had gotten into his bed and that he seized the opportunity to trap it in the bedclothes and tried to throw the spirit in the fire that was going on in the fireplace. He stated that the only thing that prevented it was the immense weight it had and the terrible smell it gave off. James Johnston's son John decided to test the spirit by asking it something no one outside of his family would know. He asked it what his step-grandmother would say to slaves when they did something wrong, and it replied in his step-grandmother's voice and Dutch accent. "Hut tut! What has happened now?" And yet another incident states that an Englishman visited the area and decided to try and investigate the haunting. As he was speaking about his family, he heard the spirit begin to imitate his parents' voices. And in the morning, the spirit woke him up again, imitating his parents' voices, who were worried because they had heard his voice all the way in England as well. The man left that very morning. Later, the Bell family received a letter from him stating that the witch had visited his parents in England and that he now regretted his initial disbelief. The only 2 people who the spirit seemed to like, or at least tolerate, were John's wife Lucy and their son John Jr. The witch declared that Lucy was the most perfect woman living and treated her with kindness. It even sang to her and cared for her when she was sick. John Jr. had long conversations with the witch, although he always continued to say that it was the spirit of the damned. Now, if you're still listening at this point, you're a trooper, and I really thank you. Your patience is about to pay off, though, because we just have 2 incidents left, and they really are the best ones. The first one involves President Andrew Jackson before he was a president. Jackson heard the rumors of the Bell Witch and wanted to see the spirit in action for himself, and so he decided to pay the Bell family a visit. He equipped himself with a wagon, horses, and a few men, and went on his way towards the farm. At some point along the way, the wagon became stuck somehow and refused to move. The men tried to get the horses to pull the wagon out of whatever was making it stuck, but no amount of whipping, pushing, or pulling would make the horses move. They also examined the wheels and even tried to have the men push the wagon, but it was no use. At this point, General Jackson had tried everything he could think of, and since nothing seemed to work, he exclaimed, "By the eternal, boys, this must be the Bell Witch." And of course, as soon as he said that, a disembodied voice replied saying, "All right, General, let the wagon move on. I will see you again tonight." And then the wagon began to immediately move forward on its own, and they continued on their way. After they set up camp, one of Jackson's men began telling stories about how he was a witch hunter and how he had a silver bullet that would kill any supernatural being that he shot with it. Jackson wasn't impressed. He turned to one of the men in the group and whispered to them, "I'll bet this fellow is an arrant coward. By the eternal, I do wish the thing would come. I want to see him run." Suddenly, there came the sound of footsteps, and a disembodied voice said, "All right, General, I'm on hand and ready for business." The spirit taunted the witch hunter, asking him to shoot it, and when the self-proclaimed witch hunter tried, the gun refused to fire. The man was then struck by an invisible force, falling to the ground and screaming in pain. He said he felt as if he was being struck by needles. He then said something had grabbed him by the nose, and then the witch hunter ran off. The spirit then said, "How the devil did run and beg. I'll bet he won't come through here again with his old pistol to shoot me. I guess that's fun enough for tonight, General, and you can go to bed now. I will come tomorrow night and show you another rascal in the crowd." Jackson wanted to stay and wait for the witch's return, but his men had decided they'd had more than enough, and so he reluctantly turned back and returned home to Nashville. Since then, Andrew Jackson said that he would rather fight the British in New Orleans than fight the Bell Witch. The last incident that happened, though, is by far the worst. As I mentioned before, the witch constantly insulted and threatened John Bell. So when he started to have certain physical maladies, such as trouble swallowing, a strange feeling in his tongue, and a twitchy feeling in his face that later spread to his whole body and ultimately turned into seizures, it was obviously caused by the witch. And so, in time, he became so ill that he had to be cared for by his son, John Bell Jr. He also began to use 3 different medications to try to help with his ailments. On December 19, 1820, John Sr. didn't get up from his bed. His son went to the cupboard to retrieve his medication and give it to him, but in its place found a single vial that was 1/3 full of what is described as an unknown, dark, smoky liquid. When the vial was discovered, the witch's voice arrogantly claimed, "It's useless for you to try to relieve old Jack. I've got him this time. He will never get up from that bed again. It's said that it had gave old Jack a big dose of it last night while he was fast asleep," meaning the liquid in the vial, and that it had fixed him. After hearing this, the family decided to test the liquid by giving 2 drops of it to the family cat. The poor animal dropped dead right on the spot. Richard Williams, yet another of John's sons, claimed that his father's breath smelled like the liquid. The family immediately threw the vial into a fire they had going in a fireplace, and the liquid erupted into blue flames. John Bell Sr. fell into a coma and passed away the next morning on December 20th. John Bell's funeral was huge. Everyone in the area showed up to pay their respects. It's said that the witch also made an appearance once they reached the graveyard and began to sing very loudly a drinking song about a bottle of brandy, and it didn't stop singing until the last person left. 3 months after this, Betsy finally broke off their engagement to Joshua Gardner. Shortly after, the witch told the family that it was leaving them, but it would return in 7 years. True to its word, in 1828, it returned to the Bell household. Lucy and her sons, Richard Williams and Joel Egbert, were living at the farm at the time and began to experience the same kind of activity again. They all took a different route this time, though, and chose to ignore it. It became bored and left soon after, claiming that it would return once again in 1935, 107 years later, to haunt the descendants of the Bell family. There have been no claims that it actually happened, however. Betsy eventually did get married, but not to Joshua. She married her old school teacher, Richard Powell, on March 21st, 1824. They moved to Mississippi and settled there. Betsy died on July 11th, 1888. In 1984, a newspaper editor by the name of Martin V. Ingram published a book called Authenticated History of the Bell Witch. It's known as the very first full record of the story. There are rumors that the land once owned by the Bells is still haunted to this day. Tourists especially report incidents happening, mostly near the area of the cave that is in the property, even though not much of the original haunting took place there. However, it is one of the few areas within the property that have remained barely changed. Maybe the spirit has clung to it because of it, which would explain the frequent supernatural phenomenon happening in the area. That's if the witch really is still there, that is. That's it for today. Comment on what you think was really haunting the Bell family, or if you think there was something else going on entirely different. And remember, like if you liked and subscribe if you want more. Until next time.